Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 31st of May 2019 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now the first article appears as an editorial on page number 10. The title of the article is Capital Buffers. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Economy under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues, particularly related to mobilization of resources. Before analyzing this particular article, let us first look into its background. Now the financial sector in India is basically dominated by banks and NBFCs. And these NBFCs are in turn categorized into the deposit taking NBFCs and the non-deposit taking NBFCs. So what has happened in case of India is that over a period of time there has been increase in the share of deposits as well as the loans which are given by the NBFCs. In other words, the NBFCs have come to play a very important role in the Indian economy. This is evident in the fact that the NBFCs are majorly involved in financing various infrastructure companies which are involved in the construction of infrastructure projects such as the roads, railways, ports, airports, etc. So in a way, the NBFCs are helping in the development of infrastructure in the country. However, the main problem with respect to NBFCs is their business model. And this business model has in turn led to the asset liability mismatch. So what exactly is the business model of the NBFC which has led to the asset liability mismatch? So here, if you look at the NBFCs, unlike the banks which have the luxury of huge amount of deposits, the NBFCs do not have adequate amount of deposits. So in order to get money, the NBFCs borrow money from the market, for which the NBFCs issue the commercial paper. Now the commercial paper are similar to the corporate bonds which are issued by the corporate entities in order to borrow money from the market. However, the basic difference between the corporate bond and a commercial paper is that the corporate bond is a long-term bond whereas the commercial paper is a short-term loan. So what basically NBFCs are doing here is the NBFCs are borrowing short-term loans from the market, and whatever money the NBFCs have borrowed, the same money is in turn lent to the infrastructure companies. So whatever money the NBFCs have raised from the market, we can call them as liability. On the other hand, the money lent by the NBFCs to the various infrastructure companies can be considered to be an asset. So the problem here is that the liabilities of the NBFCs are short-term in nature. However, the assets are long-term in nature. This is because if you look at the infrastructure projects in India, usually the gestation period, that is the time to complete the project, is at least 15 to 20 years. So the assets in the case of NBFCs are long-term in nature. The NBFCs have failed to repay their debt obligations on the commercial paper. This has led to a series of default by the NBFCs, particularly by the IL and FS company. Now for example, if a particular NBFC has borrowed 100 rupees from the market for a period of 1 year, and if this same 100 rupees is given to an infrastructure company, now the NBFC here would not be able to recover this 100 rupees for at least 10 to 15 years. However, it will be required to pay back this rupees 100 after a period of 1 year. So this leads to a concept known as the asset liability mismatch. Hence, in order to correct the asset liability mismatch of the NBFCs, the Reserve Bank of India has recently come up with guidelines. As per these guidelines, the NBFCs in India would be required to follow the concept of the liquidity coverage ratio. Now this particular concept of liquidity coverage ratio is presently followed by all the banks in the country according to the guidelines issued by the RBI. So with respect to this particular article, what you are required to understand here is How is the concept of liquidity coverage ratio different from the perspective of banks as compared to the NBFCs? Apart from that, another important concept related to the liquidity coverage ratio is the facility to avail the liquidity for LCR. This particular concept is specifically applicable to the banks. Apart from that, this particular editorial here has discussed various pros and cons with respect to application of the liquidity coverage ratio to the NBFCs in India. Apart from that, a mains question for your practice based upon this video analysis here could be the RBI's guidelines on the application of the liquidity coverage ratio to the NBFCs is a welcome step. However, it fails to address the structural problems afflicting the NBFC sector. Analyze. Let us now start the analysis of this particular article, wherein we'll discuss as to how the concept of the liquidity coverage ratio is different for banks as compared to the NBFCs. During the 2008 financial crisis, it was found out that most of the banks across the world did not have sufficient amount of cash in order to meet their day-to-day requirements. Hence, accordingly, after the 2008 financial crisis, the Basel III norms introduced the concept of the liquidity coverage ratio. So the main rationale behind the LCR is to ensure that the banks should have to maintain sufficient amount of cash requirements in order to meet their day-to-day requirements for at least a period of 30 days. So in order to calculate the liquidity coverage ratio, each and every bank is required to calculate the expected cash outflows and expected cash inflows at the start of every month. And here you need to note that this expected cash outflow and inflow is to be calculated for a period of next 30 days. For example, let's say a particular bank expects the total cash outflows for the next 30 days to be around rupees 400. On the other hand, it expects the total cash inflows to be around rupees 300. So the net cash outflows for the bank for the next 30 days is around rupees 100. Now this rupees 100 is actually the cash requirement of the bank for the next 30 days. Now even though this rupees 100 may be needed by the bank for the next 30 days, under the liquidity coverage ratio, we are forcing the banks to maintain rupees 100 at all the times during the next 30 days. So based upon our example, this rupees 100 has to be maintained in the form of the high quality liquidity assets. Now, high quality liquidity assets are essentially those assets which can be easily converted into cash without any substantial loss in their value. Now, for instance, cash can be considered to be a high quality liquidity asset. On similar lines, you can also consider gold as a high quality liquidity asset. Other forms of high quality liquidity assets include the government securities and highly rated corporate bonds. So as part of the liquidity coverage ratio, the banks have to maintain this rupees 100 in the form of cash, gold, government securities or the highly rated corporate bonds. So how the liquidity coverage ratio is actually calculated for the banks. So before understanding this, let us first revise the concepts of and the statutory liquidity ratio. Now you all must be aware the cash reserve ratio is a percentage of the deposits which the bank has to maintain with the RBI and the CRR has to be maintained only in the form of cash. On similar lines, the bank is required to maintain a certain percentage of depositors' money with itself and that percentage we refer it to as the statutory liquidity ratio. Now the SLR has to be maintained in the form of cash, gold and government securities. And if you look at the present SLR rate, it is 19%. On the other hand, the CRR rate is 4%. So in order to calculate the liquidity coverage ratio or the high quality liquidity assets for the banks can consider the cash reserves which they are maintaining outside the CRR requirements. Which means to say a bank cannot consider the CRR as part of the liquidity coverage ratio. However, it can consider the cash which is outside the CRR as part of the high quality liquidity asset. Secondly, it can consider the government securities outside SLR as part of the liquidity coverage ratio. And the third and most important component is the facility to avail liquidity coverage ratio, which is denoted as FALLCR. Now, this particular component essentially refers to certain percentage of deposits under the SLR which can be counted as the high quality liquidity assets. In other words, certain percentage of cash, gold and government security which is maintained in the form of SLR can also be taken into consideration for the calculation of the high quality liquidity asset. And this particular percentage is stipulated by the Reserve Bank of India. Now, for example, as stated before, the present SLR rate is 19%, which has been denoted in the form of the red color and the blue color in this particular diagram. So both these components here together account for 19%. However, according to the RBI guidelines, the present facility to avail LCR has been stipulated at 17%. That means to say the 17% of the deposits under the SLR can be counted as the high quality liquidity asset. So accordingly here, if you look at this particular diagram, the red color here is in the form of the FALLCR, which is at 17%. So you can see here the FALLCR is actually a part of the SLR. Now, in order to understand this, let us go back to our previous example where a particular bank is required to maintain a LCR of rupees 100. So this rupees 100 here can be maintained in the form of cash reserves outside the CRR requirements. It can be maintained in the form of the government securities. Apart from these two factors, 17% of the deposits under the SLR can be taken into consideration as high quality liquidity asset. Now, for example, if a particular bank has totally 100 rupees in the form of deposits, accordingly it will keep 19 rupees with itself in the form of cash, gold and government securities, and that is the SLR. Now, out of these 19 rupees, 17 rupees here can be considered as the high quality liquidity asset under the LCR. So one of the most important difference between the liquidity coverage ratio for the banks and NBFCs is that this particular component of facility to avail LCR is specifically applicable only to the banks and it is not applicable to the NBFCs. However, all the concepts related to the liquidity coverage ratio are similar to banks as well as the NBFCs. Now coming to the pros and cons of the application of liquidity coverage ratio to the NBFCs. Now with respect to the pros, first and foremost, as the liquidity coverage ratio forces the NBFCs to maintain sufficient amount of high quality liquidity asset, it would be able to solve the problem of the asset liability mismatch which we had discussed before. Secondly, by addressing the problem of asset liability mismatch, we would be able to prevent the future defaults on the repayment of the debt obligations of the NBFCs. Thirdly, since the NBFCs have borrowed heavily from the banks and the mutual fund companies, so the default by the NBFCs has a capability to affect the entire financial sector, leading to a contagion effect. Hence, the application of LCR to the NBFCs would be able to prevent the contagion effect on the Indian economy. Now, with respect to cons of application of LCR to the NBFCs, first and foremost, it can be argued that it does not address the present problem of the liquidity crunch of the NBFCs. Now, presently, the NBFCs are unable to fulfill their debt obligations because of the shortage of liquidity. In this regard, the NBFCs have been arguing that the RBI should open a separate liquidity window for the NBFCs. However, this application of LCR does not address this particular problem faced by the NBFCs. Secondly, it can also be stated that through the application of LCR, we are forcing the NBFCs to maintain sufficient amount of cash with themselves, because of which the NBFCs will not be able to give more amount of loans to the infrastructure financing companies, and thus this would affect the profit margins of the NBFCs. And lastly, it can also be argued that the infrastructure finance companies which are so far dependent upon the NBFCs for their financing needs will not be able to avail more amount of loans from the NBFCs, and this would in turn has an adverse impact on the infrastructure development in the country. However, looking at both the pros and cons of application of LCR to the NBFCs, it can be argued that this particular application will lead to a short-term pain but a long-term benefit for the NBFCs. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to this particular article. Further, based upon our video analysis, you can try writing answer to this mains practice question. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 12. This particular article talks about the electoral reforms in India. Hence, this article becomes important mainly from the perspective of GS paper 2, governance, under the subsection salient features of the Representation of People's Act, which deals with the conduct of elections in India. Apart from that, this article also becomes important because a rated question on the electoral reforms has been asked in the UPSC Mains 2016. Recently, an NGO by the name Association for the Democratic Reforms has carried out an analysis of the criminal background of the newly elected MPs to the Lok Sabha. In this particular report, the Association for the Democratic Reforms has highlighted that 43% of the MPs in the Lok Sabha are facing criminal charges, wherein almost around 30% of the cases against the MPs are related to serious crimes such as rape, murder, and various crimes against the women. Now, what is a worrying factor apart from these factors is that a candidate with a criminal cases has a greater chance of winning as compared to a candidate with a clean background. Now, all these facts and figures clearly raise a very grave concern with respect to Indian democracy since it leads to the criminalization of Indian politics. Now, the criminalization of Indian politics basically means the entry of criminals into the political parties, parliament, or the state legislature. So, the criminalization of Indian politics would lead to the politicization of crime, the breakdown in law and order, and it poses a grave threat to the Indian democracy. In this regard, the Election Commission of India had appointed 9 working groups in order to give recommendations to improve the electoral process in India. Hence, this particular article is based upon the recommendations given by these 9 working groups. As part of this video analysis, we'll understand certain important recommendations given by these 9 working groups. The 9 working groups appointed by the Election Commission have dealt with mainly 4 aspects related to the electoral reforms. Now, these 4 aspects are related to the filing of affidavits by the candidates who are contesting the elections, the changes in the criteria for contesting elections, the changes with respect to model code of conduct, and changes with respect to the registration of political parties. Hence, in this regard, let us start analyzing these 4 aspects of the article one by one, starting with the filing of affidavits by the candidates contesting the elections. Now, presently, Section 33A of the Representation of People's Act provides for the disclosure of criminal antecedents by the candidates who are contesting the elections. Under this particular section, a person who is accused of any offences which is punishable with an imprisonment of 2 years or more is required to disclose his criminal background. Such a section has been incorporated in the Representation of People's Act in order to provide for informed decision making by the voters. However, the main problem with respect to implementation of this particular section is that even though a number of candidates have been accused of serious offences, such candidates have failed to disclose their criminal background. So this particular failure by the candidates to disclose the criminal background has in turn led to the criminalization of the Indian politics. Now, presently, the Section 33A of the RPA Act provides that if a candidate fails to disclose his criminal background, then he shall be imprisoned for a period of 6 months. Now, the working group appointed by the Election Commission feels that this particular period of 6 months does not act as a deterring factor. In this regard, the working group has suggested that the punishment for filing the false affidavits should be increased to 2 years from the present 6 months. Now, coming to the second suggestion with respect to the criteria for contesting the elections. Now, the Section 8 of the RPA Act deals with the disqualification of the candidates who are contesting the elections. And according to this particular section, any person who is convicted or sentenced to imprisonment for any of the listed offences under the RPA Act shall be disqualified from the time of his conviction to 6 years after his release. Now, one important aspect which you should note here is that this particular disqualification is only applicable to those persons who are convicted of any offences. However, the disqualification is not applicable to the people who are accused of certain offences. Now, one main problem with respect to Section 8 of the RPA Act is that this particular section gives a scope for the convicted persons to contest the elections after 6 years beyond their release. So, even though Section 8 of the RPA Act has been enacted in order to prevent the criminalization of Indian politics, it has failed to live up to its expectations because of this particular provision, which enables a person to contest elections after 6 years after his release. Hence, in this regard, the working group has suggested that the Section 8 of the RPA Act has to provide for permanent disqualification of the candidates in certain offences, such as the offences related to corruption, or if a person is involved in any serious crimes such as rapes, murders, etc. Now, the next aspect of the electoral reforms is with respect to the changes in the Model Code of Conduct. Presently, the Model Code of Conduct prohibits the political parties from making promises in their election manifesto. This is done in order to ensure that the political parties are not able to unduly influence the voters in their favor. Further, the Model Code of Conduct states that if any political party is making any kind of promises, the election manifesto should indicate the means to achieve those promises. Now, for example, if a political party is giving a promise of free water, electricity, etc. in its election manifesto, such a political party should have to indicate as to how it will be able to provide these freebies. On similar lines, if a political party is promising an income support scheme for the poor and vulnerable sections of the Indian society in its election manifesto, then such a political party should have to state as to how it will generate the resources in order to meet the expenditure of this particular scheme. Now, the main problem with respect to this aspect of the Model Code of Conduct is that most of the political parties in India have promised a lot of freebies to be given to their voters. However, they have failed to indicate as to how they will generate the finances in order to fulfill their promises. In this regard, the working group of the Election Commission has suggested that the Election Commission of India should have to be empowered in order to issue notices to the political parties for making corrections in their manifestos. In other words, the Election Commission of India should force the political parties to indicate the financial means to achieve the promises which the political parties make in their election manifestos. The fourth aspect of the electoral reforms is related to the registration of political parties. Now, Section 29A of the Representation of People's Act provides that the political parties in India shall be registered by the Election Commission. However, the main problem with respect to this particular section is that presently the number of members required to register a new political party is quite less, wherein Section 29A stipulates that a minimum of 100 people can come together in order to form a political party. So this particular lower threshold on the formation of political party has mainly two problems. First and foremost, this has led to an increase in number of political parties in India. And secondly, some of the political parties have been set up mainly in order to convert the black money into white money. Apart from this particular problem, a large number of political parties have been mainly funded to the black money. In other words, there is lack of transparency in the funding of elections, and this is in turn adversely affecting the electoral process in India. Hence, in order to address these problems, the working group of the Election Commission has given a number of suggestions. First and foremost, it has highlighted that the number of members required to register a new political party should have to be increased from 100 to 1000. Secondly, it has stated that those political parties which do not field any candidates in the elections should have to be immediately deregistered by the Election Commission. And thirdly, in order to improve the transparency in the funding of elections, the working group has suggested that there has to be a comprehensive bill for the registration and the funding of political parties in India. So these are some of the important aspects which have been highlighted by the working groups of the Election Commission. Further, based upon our analysis, a mains question for your practice could be: the criminalization of politics and politicization of crime have formed a symbiotic association which threatens the democratic system in India. In this regard, suggest certain amendments in the Representation of People's Act in order to counter this menace. Now you can try writing answer to this particular question based upon our video analysis. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears on page number 15. This particular article basically deals with the exploration of the rare earth minerals. Hence, accordingly, this article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Economic Geography of India and the World. Now, this particular article here highlights that three public sector units, that is, the National Aluminium Company, Mineral Exploration Corporation Limited, and Hindustan Copper Limited, all these three public sector units have together formed a joint venture known as the Khanij Bidesh Limited. In short, it is also known as KABIL. Now, the main objective of setting up of this joint venture is to explore and mine certain strategic minerals such as lithium, cobalt, and certain rare earth minerals. Now, with respect to lithium and cobalt, these two materials find a number of applications. For example, they are used in manufacturing of batteries for the electric cars. They are used in the manufacturing of mobile phones as well as the manufacturing of the solar modules. However, one main problem with respect to the availability of lithium and cobalt is that India does not have sufficient amount of reserves of these two materials. Because of this particular reason, India imports almost 100% of its lithium needs. In this regard, the Indian government has launched the National Mission on Transformative Mobility in order to give fillip to electrical mobility and electrical storage. Hence, in this regard, by setting up of Khanij Bidesh Limited, India would be able to address its needs for electric mobility and electric storage. Now, what has happened is that recently the Khanij Bidesh Limited has signed a memorandum of understanding with Bolivia for the exploration of lithium. Now, why this particular memorandum of understanding is important is because Bolivia accounts for almost 25% of the global lithium reserves, wherein the Uyuni mine in Bolivia has the world's largest lithium reserves. And if you look at these three countries, that is Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, all these three countries together form the lithium triangle, accounting for one of the largest share of the lithium reserves across the world. Apart from this, as part of this video analysis, let us also understand the various aspects related to the rare earth minerals. Now, the rare earth minerals are actually a group of 17 chemical elements on the periodic table. These 17 chemical elements are scandium, yttrium, and 15 lanthanides as highlighted on the periodic table. Now, one of the most important aspects related to the rare earth minerals is that even though they are called as rare earth minerals, they are not actually rare. Rather, they are found in abundance in the earth's surface. Now, the main problem with respect to exploitation of the rare earth minerals is that it is difficult to find high concentration of these rare earth minerals in a single place, because of which it becomes economically unviable to exploit the rare earth minerals. Now, with respect to significance of the rare earth minerals, these rare earth minerals have distinctive electrical, metallurgical, nuclear, and magnetic properties. So, because of these distinctive properties, the rare earth minerals are used in a high-end technology such as lasers, magnets, batteries, and the optical fibers. For example, if you look at this particular table highlights the rare earth minerals and their application. Now, for example, lanthanum is used in the manufacturing of the night vision goggles. On similar lines, erbium is used as amplifiers in the optical fiber data transmission. On similar lines, samarium is used in defense technology for the manufacturing of the precision guided weapons. So, if you look at the reserves of the rare earth minerals across the world, China has the highest reserves of the rare earth minerals. Apart from that, China has also emerged as the leading producer of the rare earth minerals. And when it comes to India, presently India accounts for only 6% of the global reserves of the rare earth minerals. Now, the rare earth minerals were recently in news in the context of the trade war between United States of America and China. Now, in this particular trade war, recently China has threatened that it would stop exporting the rare earth minerals to USA if this particular trade war escalates in future. So these are some of the important aspects which one must know with respect to rare earth minerals. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now, the next article appears on page number 13. This particular article basically talks about the appointment of the pro tem speaker. Hence, accordingly, this article shall be important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Indian Polity and Governance. Apart from that, this article is also important because if you look at the previous year UPSC prelims, questions have been asked with respect to the office of Speaker. In this regard, let us understand certain basic details related to the office of the pro tem speaker. Pro tem is essentially a Latin phrase which means for the time being, which means to say the office of pro tem speaker is a temporary office which exists until the time the office of speaker is elected by the Lok Sabha. So the pro tem speaker conducts the proceedings of the Lok Sabha immediately after the general elections. So with respect to the appointment of the pro tem speaker, usually the pro tem speaker is appointed through consensus among all the members, and if you look at the parliamentary convention, usually the senior-most member among the Lok Sabha members is appointed as the pro tem speaker. Now the main role of the pro tem speaker is to preside over the proceedings of the house when the elections for the speaker and the deputy speaker is conducted. It is to be noted that usually according to the parliamentary convention, the office of speaker goes to the ruling party. On the other hand, the office of deputy speaker goes to the opposition party. And the other important role of the pro tem speaker is to administer the oath of office to the newly elected MPs. Now this particular oath of office of the newly elected MPs has been mentioned under the third schedule of the Indian Constitution. So keeping this as a background, let us now solve the previous year prelims questions. Now the first question here is, consider the following statements. Now the first statement here is, the Speaker of Legislative Assembly shall vacate his office if he ceases to be a member of the Assembly. Now this particular statement here is correct. The second statement reads as, whenever the Legislative Assembly is dissolved, the Speaker shall vacate his office immediately. Now this particular statement here is wrong. This is because the Speaker continues to remain in the office when the Legislative Assembly is dissolved. However, the Speaker vacates his office immediately before the first session of the newly elected Legislative Assembly. Such a provision has been added in the Indian Constitution so as to ensure the continuity in the office of the Speaker. And accordingly, the answer to this particular question is A, that is one only. Now coming to a second question which was asked in the prelims 2017. In the election for the Lok Sabha or the State Legislative Assembly, the winning candidate must get at least 50% of the votes polled to be declared as elected. Now this particular option here is wrong. This is because the winning candidate need not secure 50% of the votes. Rather, he needs to ensure that he gets the majority of the votes. The second statement reads as, according to the provisions laid down in the Constitution of India, in the Lok Sabha, the Speaker's post goes to the majority party and the deputy speakers to the opposition. Now, as we have discussed before, usually the office of Speaker is held by a person belonging to the ruling party. On the other hand, the office of Deputy Speaker is held by a person belonging to the opposition party. However, this is not a provision which has been laid down in the Indian Constitution. Rather, it is a parliamentary convention which has been followed in India. So accordingly, if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question is D, neither 1 nor 2. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now the next article appears in the Friday Review on page number 4. This particular article talks about a folk dance known as the Kalbelia. Hence, this article becomes important mainly from the perspective of prelims under the subsection Cultural History of India. Apart from that, this article is also important because a related question related to folk dances has been asked in the previous year UPSC prelims. Hence, as part of this video analysis, let us understand certain basic details related to the Kalbelia folk dance. Now, the Kalbelia folk dance is actually performed by the members of the Kalbelia community in Rajasthan. It is to be noted that the Kalbelia community is traditionally involved in the catching of snakes and the trading of the snake venom. The Kalbelia dance is performed by both men as well as women, wherein the women wear long black skirts and through their dance movements they replicate the movements of a snake. On the other hand, the males play the musical instruments such as the kanjari and pungi. The pungi musical instrument is traditionally played in order to capture the snakes. Apart from that, one important aspect which you should note with respect to the Kalbelia dance form is that this particular dance form has been listed under the UNESCO World Intangible Cultural Heritage. So having understood certain basic details related to the Kalbelia folk dance, let us now solve the previous year UPSC prelims question. The question here is, which of the following pairs of the folk dance forms and states is not correctly matched? Now, among the pairs of the folk dances and the states which are mentioned here, option B, C and D are correct. However, when it comes to Korku dance form, it is actually performed in the state of Madhya Pradesh and not in Maharashtra. Hence, accordingly, the correct answer to this particular question is A. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now, the next article appears as a lead article on page number 10. Now, this particular article basically discusses about the various issues and concerns with respect to bills which have lapsed upon the dissolution of the Lok Sabha. So this particular article has raised certain issues and concerns with respect to the transgender bill, the anti-trafficking bill and the surrogacy bill. It is to be noted that all the issues and concerns related to these three bills have been covered in various DNS videos previously. Now, for example, the issues and concerns with respect to transgender bill has been covered by Mehak ma'am on 20th of December 2018. Similarly, the issues and concerns with respect to anti-trafficking bill has been covered in the DNS video 27th of December 2018. And when it comes to the issues with respect to surrogacy bill, it has been covered in the DNS dated 24th of December 2018. So I request you to go to this particular three DNS in order to understand the various issues and concerns with respect to these three bills. Apart from that, the important highlights of this particular article have been included in the PDF for your reference. Now, based upon our video analysis, these 4 questions shall be a prelims question for the practice. Please pause this video and try to find answers to these 4 questions. We shall be discussing the answer after 5 seconds. Now, the first question here is, consider the following statements related to the facility to avail liquidity under the liquidity coverage ratio. The first statement here is, it refers to the percentage of deposits under the SLR which can be considered for the calculation of the liquidity coverage ratio. As we have discussed, this statement here is correct, and according to the RBI guidelines, 17% of the SLR can be calculated as the liquidity coverage ratio. The second statement reads as, presently the FALLCR is applicable both to the banks as well as NBFCs. Now this statement here is wrong. This is because presently FALLCR is applicable only to the banks and not to the NBFCs. So the correct answer to this particular question is A, that is one only. Now coming to the second question here, the question is, which among the following can be considered as high quality liquidity assets for the calculation of the liquidity coverage ratio by the banks? The first option here is CRR deposits of the bank to the RBI. As we have discussed, the CRR deposits cannot be considered as high quality liquidity assets under the LCR. Hence, this option here is wrong. The second statement reads as entire deposits under the SLR. Now, even this statement here is wrong. This is because only 17% of the SLR can be considered as the high quality liquid assets. However, as we have discussed, the 3 components which are mentioned here can be considered for the calculation of the liquidity coverage ratio. And accordingly, the correct answer to this question is C. Now coming to the third question, the question here is, consider the following statements related to the rare earth minerals. The first statement here is, these minerals are found rarely on the earth's surface. Now this statement here is wrong. This is because the rare earth minerals are not actually rare. Rather, they are not found in abundance at a particular place, because of which their commercial exploitation becomes extremely unviable. The second statement reads as, India has the world's largest reserves of rare earth minerals. Now this statement here is also wrong. This is because China has the world's largest reserves of rare earth minerals. Apart from that, China is also considered as the largest producer of the rare earth minerals. Now if you look at the third statement here, as we have discussed, the third statement here is correct. So the answer to this question is C. Now coming to the last question, the question here is, which among the following folk dances are associated with Rajasthan? It is to be noted that Kalbelia, Teradali and Ghumar are associated with Rajasthan. However, Dumhal is associated with Jammu and Kashmir, whereas Langver is associated with Uttarakhand. So if you look at the options which are given here, the correct answer to this particular question is B, that is 1, 2 and 4. With this, we have come to end of today's discussion. Now let us look at the question for the day.